Welcome back to the KDPG Sunday edition. It is Pride Week in Pittsburgh, ending today with more events downtown Pittsburgh. You can check Google for further information. We're joined by Gary Van Horn, president of the Delta Foundation of Pittsburgh, which is putting a lot of these events together, and the organization's director of marketing and development, Chris Bryan. What is the state of the LGBTQ community in Pittsburgh? Is it growing? Do you keep track of membership in some ways? Where does the movement stand today relative to, say, 5 or 10 years ago?
Everybody who comes to Pride has a card.
Of course.
Swipe it. It's like an advantage card.
Okay. Not what I meant. Right. But just in terms of involvement, your email lists, the people who show up at events, people who get in touch with you for whatever reason.
Continuing to grow. And we're seeing increases in the event, as far as we can measure, in about 20 to 25,000 each year. And I think a lot of that we attribute to also allies. We have to remember that the allies coming to the table, the supporters of the community, are what's driving that.
Actually, the Delta Foundation, our Facebook page, is a very active Facebook page. We have about 80,000 Facebook fans, which 80,000 Facebook fans, that's a lot and we're the second largest Facebook fan followed page in the country. And you would think New York, San Francisco, LA would be big. We're only behind New York by about 10,000. So it's kind of interesting just to see the engagement here in Pittsburgh. I think that there's a lot of engagement. There's a lot of conversations. The state of Pittsburgh, we have a very supportive mayor. We have a very supportive county executive and a very supportive governor here in Pittsburgh, or in Pennsylvania. I think that there is still concern. I mean, there's elections that are happening, midterms in the fall, and I think, where are we from a national standpoint? We've seen a lot of rollback of pro-LGBT equality under the Trump administration.
In what ways?
Or not. A lot to do with the transgender community. You look at some of it has been put on hold. He wanted to ban transgender troops in the military, protections as it relates to transgender individuals in high schools. Just rolling those type of things back. There's the White House under Bush and also Bush and Obama both had Pride months and Pride events at the White House, bringing together leaders across the country and having a conversation. This is the first time that in the last at least 8 years prior to that the White House has not invited LGBT leaders to the White House. So
Trump, as a candidate, ran saying he would be a great friend to the gay community. Obama wouldn't even sanction, nor would Hillary Clinton sanction a same-sex marriage when they started out, right?
They were both in support of same-sex domestic partnerships, and I think that we see, just like we've seen everybody else evolve on the issue. I think when you understand and put diverse people around you, I think you really understand who people are and really understand that we all have the same struggles. And I have this question to ask all the time, and I say, at the end of the day, we're talking about love. And this country right now, and this world right now, could use a little bit more love.
It's also mainstreaming. It's the people on same-sex marriage, the people got ahead of the politicians, which seemed to the point like, I don't want to get there, and then suddenly it happens, and a lot of people are like, those two guys got married. Oh yeah, they're nice guys, and now they can have like a tedious life like the rest of us. Argue over lint in the dryer and so forth. So, but again, I just my thing is normalization is, or maybe that's not the right word, but just becoming uncontroversial.
I think becoming aware that the world's a pretty diverse place, and when you become aware of some of this, not like yourself, you find out and you take off those road color glasses, and that we love to live. I mean, in Pittsburgh a few years ago they did a study, and 51% of Pennsylvanians never traveled more than 50 miles from their home. 50 miles from their home.
Hey, but there's a lot of rivers out there.
So you have to go over a bridge and through a tunnel, which people don't like to do, right? So I mean, if you think about that, you don't really get to embrace different cultures if you don't travel out where you're born.
But a question that a lot of maybe social conservatives put are like, are you going to convert young people to being gay? And I have teenage daughters, and the options available or on gender, it's so wide open, and kids adjust. But isn't it true that today for kids there's a rapid evolution in gender identity, and is that
definitely the younger generation? I think we're seeing is they don't really care, and I see it with my nieces a lot, where they're it's not an issue with them, and I think that's just a generational thing as we see that generation.
But there's a lot of rules. I mean, there's a lot of like, well, classified, and I'm a they, and this, and
The alphabet soup of letters.
Yeah,
we call
yeah,
it.
Yeah,
Right, right.
the pronouns,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that what you're seeing is, when I was growing up, there was a belief that if you were a member of the gay community, that you could not be successful in life, that you would have hardships growing up and even in through adulthood. And I think what you're seeing now is because there's broader acceptance, because corporations are embracing diversity and talking about inclusion, I think people are able to live authentically. If you're pushed into a box, you'll move into that box. When you see the world as a pretty wild place and there's all kinds of different people, how's that a bad thing at the end of the day? If a kid wants to wear, if a guy wants to wear nail polish or dress a certain way, what's the difference? At the end of the day, what's the difference? It's just something different,
So are we maybe a generation or two away from looking back on events like Pride Week and saying, oh, how quaint. They used to find it necessary to celebrate this publicly and say, here we are, we're proud that we're a vibrant community, we deserve equal justice and everything. That'll no longer be necessary in the same way that, we don't necessarily have civil rights marches anymore, even though in some
I would
cases-
hope that that's the case. I think we're a long way off. I think even the civil rights movement, there's still obviously racism throughout this country. But beyond that, I think what Pride really, it's that young person that is just, going through high school and just getting into high school that's struggling with who they are. And then they come to an event like Pride and they see people that are just like themselves or act like themselves or look like themselves or whatever. It allows them. We actually got contacted through the foundation about a 22-year-old kid that's a firefighter. He's been a firefighter since he was 16. He was a junior firefighter, et cetera. And he belonged to a fire hall. He's out there serving the public and running into fires and saving lives. And he now is in a place in his life, and he's actually working for Penn Hills Fire Company, and they're actually participating in the march this year. And he is so proud that finally he's at a place where he's accepted at work. And the fire truck's going to be there from Penn Hills, and he was able to bring all his and the guys that work with him and the girls that work with him, they're coming to support him too. Think about that's what it's about at the end of the day, because we hear about all kinds of different things about young kids that struggle. There's high suicide with young kids, etc. And here, this kid just wants to be accepted and serve the public. And he's now at a position, and he's working for a fire company that actually embraces him.
And they want to work for companies where they can be themselves, because no one wants to hide and no one wants to be careful of their pronouns. And I think when we talk about corporations being involved at Pride, they're interested in different voices. They recognize that by having different people with different backgrounds around the table, that's how creative ideas flow. That's how you get different, people's life experiences that they can bring to work. And so those companies are hungry for different types, different ways of thinking.
They want the best employees, I would imagine, regardless of whatever their personal lives may be, and they're interested in profit. And an interesting piece this week in the Washington Post opinion piece by Petula Dvorak, who says that market forces, not this narrow court ruling about the wedding cake, are winning the day. She says, check out Walmart's Pride section. Walmart, the company that stopped selling Confederate flag bikinis and beer cozies because consumers showed they weren't interested in that anymore. They weren't buying enough. Now you can go online at Walmart's website and you can buy a 50 Shades of Gay t-shirt with a Rainbow USA or a brightly colored Closets Are for Clothes t-shirt.
Well, let me tell you about Walmart.
Walmart.
So Walmart, for the first time last year, scored a perfect 100 on the Human Rights Campaign Corporate Equality Index, which is a measurement of how companies treat their LGBT employees. And every year, they change the qualifications and raise the bar even higher. Got their first 100. There was a manager in Walmart at the Tarentum Walmart store who was so proud and so excited that he contacted us and said, we want to come and participate in the march. We said, great, get your group together, come on down. Well, it became then a regional initiative very quickly. And at the end of the day, they had 423 people come march in the march last year. And this year, they're at like 575 people. So excited to come and be so proud of their company. And I think when you step back and think about that, these are probably mostly hourly employees working for the largest company in the world who are going to come down and march in support of their LGBT friends, their LGBT families. They're either members of the community or allies, and they're beyond excited to come.
But even if a company doesn't care at all about social causes, and they're merely interested in profit. This piece says there's money to be made. That the market forces are saying this is where America is right now.
Well, I will tell you, as a community member and as a leader, I guess you could say, with the LGBT community, we don't necessarily have a litmus test, but we want to make sure that while profit is one thing, and we understand that companies need to make money to invest money back into communities, et cetera, we want to make sure it's authentic. And we've walked away from the table from more than once, from organizations that wanted to participate from a truly marketing standpoint. And weren't ready for it, weren't internally ready for it. But we have organizations, let's talk about the Pirates, or let's talk about the Penguins. They've both embraced the LGBT community. They've talked about, bullying as it relates to LGBT community. We're having we have some folks, CEOs, marching with us at Pride this year. I think while they're trying to make a dollar, we also want to make sure it's authentic and their internal policies are protecting the LGBT community.
And we'll work with those communities to make sure those are in place before they're ready to come outside.
Is Pride Week, are all of the events associated with it just absolutely accepted now as routine, or is there still any resistance?
Oh, we have protesters out there. We always will.
But I mean, in any, maybe the day of, you're saying, like when
absolutely.
It's happening. But as you're planning things, is this just part of the fabric of Pittsburgh now? This is what happens every summer in Pittsburgh, and it's no problem.
It's funny. We've been setting up for the last few days for different elements, et cetera. And people, oh, what's going on? Pittsburgh Pride. Oh, I love it. It's so colorful. People are so happy whenever it's funny. The Public Works guys have been out and they've been working really hard. And they came up to me the other day and they said, you know what? We love your parade that's going to happen today. Everybody's happy. Everybody's colorful. It's great people watching, they say, and they want their picture with us. He says, we have all kinds of parades in the city and nobody ever wants to take we're fat and old and whatever they said, etc. And they're like, they want to take the picture. We don't get it, but they love us. It's all good. So.
But I think we need to remember, while in Pittsburgh that's the way it is, there's lots of small towns that has struggled with their prides, that struggle with their local government officials on getting permits.
Yeah.
And I think we also need to remember that internationally, there's still,
Sure.
I think, 22 countries where you can still be killed just for being gay. And there's big struggles happening internationally still.
Good message. Thank you. Got it. Thoughts in just a moment.